Hi, everyone, and welcome to the QuitCast. My name is Becca, and this is our last episode of the Recovery from Burnout series. And we have talked at length about burnout on this channel. If you haven't seen the previous burnout videos, please check out our playlist so you can watch all of those, especially if you are in burnout right now or if you're in burnout recovery. So the place I always land when we're talking burnout recovery is this is never really over in the sense that you won't ever feel like it never happened. So one of the biggest questions we get is how to get back to normal, quote unquote, after you're in burnout recovery. And because I've also been going through burnout this winter and I'm finally out of it enough to be back on the regular road of work. And the piece of returning to work at full throttle after burnout recovery is that you're going to always have that sense that if you push yourself too hard, you're going to get back into burnout. But if you've addressed the issues that caused the burnout in the first place, and if you are actively generating energy pennies on a regular basis in order to make up for the overuse at certain times, because that's why the energy penny bank exists, because sometimes you use more than you produce and then you fill it back up, and you use more than you produce and you fill it back up. So there's going to be that feeling at all times that the bottom of the pit or the bottom of the bank is closer than I want to admit it is. And while that is true, it is close now that you know this is what happens to you. And some of you have been doing burnout over and over your whole life, like phoenixing essentially, right? Your whole life. And you know that the bottom of the pit is there. It is possible. The danger, though, is if you don't push yourself back and start being at full throttle again on some level, then you're never really going to get out of burnout recovery. There's always going to be that feeling that you're ready to slide back at any moment. And the farther you are away from the actual rock bottom part of burnout, if you hit the rock bottom, and we'll talk about that in a second, but if you did hit the rock bottom, and you're far away from it, and you've addressed the issues that got you into burnout in the first place, and or the pressures have come off or whatever, a lot of common things that happen are I slow down my release schedule or my writing schedule, I put reading back into my life again, I get out and do new and different things, I get a part-time job so that the financial pressure isn't quite so big. All of those things that you're doing positively to keep the stakes from getting back to the place that's going to drive you into burnout again, then the more of those things that you have done or are doing, the more likely it is that you want to start pushing yourself again. So I always liken the process of burnout recovery to the process of physical recovery. If any of you have ever had major surgery before, you know that you do one step forward, one step back, two steps forward, one step back for a while, and then you get to a point where your doctor says you're physically recovered enough that I need you to start building the muscles and working again, right? It's that feeling of something traumatic happened to my body, and there is a natural tendency to protect, like self-protect, and shell up, right? So that we don't have that kind of thing happen again. But the downside of that feeling is that while it's helpful during burnout recovery, where I'm at 25%, 50%, 75% of where I used to be, once I get back into a place where I'm 90, 95% again, that's when I really want to start pushing the edges. So pushing the edges at 25%, not a great thing. We talked about that in other videos, but pushing the edges at 80%, 90%, 95%, that's important, because that's where we start to really reach our full capacity again. And we're never going to get back to the full capacity unless on some level we start taking that repetitive action. So I may not return to the release schedule that I used to have or the writing schedule that I used to have, but I may still start setting deadlines again. I may still start meeting with my friends and expecting myself to write regularly and set a pre-order, etc., something like that. I may still do that. It's going to feel a little bit like And it's not PTSD, but it's not dissimilar from PTSD. The big differentiator that I hear other people who are medical talking about the difference between those two is that the representation is a bigger part of PTSD, right? When you have that, you represent as though it's really happening to you in that moment. And generally speaking, the trauma of burnout, unless you hit the pit in a big, spectacular way, is usually not trauma on that level. But it's not that it can't be, it's just that it is not usually that way. Usually it's the memories, and I don't want this to happen again. And how do I learn from this mistake? So if I've fixed the issues and I have learned from the mistakes that I did make, some burnout doesn't happen because we make mistakes, though. Some burnout happens because something happens to us, and then our plate unbalances, right? And then we kind of careen off into not being out of control, right? Like we talked about in the last video. So when we don't have those stressors anymore, or we've released some of the pressure or the stakes, or we've compensated for the mistakes we made if we made them, then there's a point at which we have to return to 100%. So just as a for instance, when I went through my burnout, I was super aware that I could not coach the regular number of hours every day. Just wasn't happening. We reduced my coaching hours, took a lot of the people off and gave them to the other coaches in the BFA. And thank God they existed, because I don't know what I would have done if they hadn't existed, been there. But I knew that I didn't have that capacity. But I've also, now that I'm out of the burnout pit and I'm starting to pull myself back out into 100%, I'm not there yet, maybe 95. But now I'm starting to do more hours of coaching a day. I'm starting to push myself to get back to content creation. I'm starting to write nonfiction again. Those things, pushing myself back to that place. I don't want to go farther than I should, right? Like I don't want to go back to the place that I was in, or back to the stressors that got me to that place. Although I couldn't replicate that particular situation last fall and everything that happened. It's not possible to replicate that. But if I don't address the issues, then I'm never going to get back to really 100%. And this is something that has come up in a couple of our Facebook groups over the last week. There was an article, and I'll see if I can grab the link and post it here, about what we get wrong when we talk about burnout, which I think it's really good because it addresses some of the things that people who are struggling with being burned out, but don't feel like they had the typical burnout experience of like hitting the bottom of the pit and all of the, requisite descriptions of how we talk about burnout, where it's either more prolonged or it's more systemic. And I thought it was a really good treatment of what it looks like when that happens. And there's always some kind of an imbalance systemically when that burnout situation lasts for so long or continues to drive us into those places. And even just the pandemic or unrest or ongoing social issues for us that have been maybe present for us for our whole lives, when they reach a fever pitch or a point where I can't any longer really balance them, our brains respond by wanting to not, like being lethargic, wanting to not do the same level that we did before, because we just run out of stores of energy, of being able to produce that constant work or the constant activity or the constant thought process, even when there's no reward, right? So there definitely are places where burnout can be more prolonged. And then we would treat it more like fatigue rather than burnout, even though they are different. But again, like when there are things that you have addressed and you want to get to that place of recovery, then you do need to start pushing yourself. So like I've returned back to a semi-normal schedule of coaching and have returned back to some content production again. And I'm still putting things on the coaches' plates, putting things on my admin's plates, putting things off, like either saying no to things or putting things off. I do a lot of, this is not my job anymore, right? Like that has kind of become a little bit of a catchphrase in the back of my head, where I think is this something that only I can do? And if it isn't, then I'm not going to engage with that anymore, because that's part of what gets me into these places of burnout. Just the type of personality that I have is wanting to take everything on my shoulders and wanting to be the person who's like, okay, let me fix this problem. Like I got it, right? Like from the last video, which is just hilarious because yeah, it never works. But what's interesting about the process of burnout recovery is that I personally do feel like I can hear how recovered people are, or I can hear how recovered I am based on that kind of baseline of how I was before, or the baseline of what you would notice or I would notice if I have known the person for a long time or have coached them for a long time. I can almost always hear like, oh, you're almost there. Yeah, it's time to start pushing again, right? So when you feel that sense of urgency and it is not coupled with the feeling at 75, 50, or 25 where I just don't have the capacity. Once you hit 50, it's like I have a little more capacity, and 75% sounds like I think I'm getting there. Like I feel like I'm recovered, but I'm afraid of burning out again, right? So I feel like I want to do more, but what happens if? And so I would say once we get out of that recovery completely and we are back to the way that we were, it's so important to keep an eye out for signs where I may be in danger of unbalancing my plate. Because if I work at the same exact level that I was and I allow the stakes to get back to where I was, and I make myself work the way that I was working before, then I am going to end up in that place again. And like I said, some of us phoenix, so some of us go up and down, and that is a success archetype, by the way. You can phoenix and stay extremely healthy. It's just how do you manage the phoenixing? And then when you work hard, work hard, work hard, and then don't recover and instead keep going, then all it takes is one event to unbalance your plate at that really high level. And then that's usually when the burnout happens. So burnout recovery, again, the whole core of ending this series is to say it's good to push yourself when you get out of that place where you're below 75% recovered, above 75, above 80, above 90, which I know it depends, but it really does depend for each person. This is one of the things that bothers me the most about when I write a nonfiction book myself. It is so hard to speak to 100% of people, no matter what you are doing. And the way I always think of it is, and somebody said this to me this week about writing books, and I was like, yes, that's exactly how I think of it, is each individual book that you might read is helpful for 60% of the population, but it's unhelpful for 40% of the population. And it's a different 60/40 for each book that you read. So there is no like, oh, every single book has no application to 40% of the entire population. No, every book has a different 60/40 that it speaks to, or every process or every, I don't know, test or whatever. Every person, every coach, every therapist has a different 60/40. And so when you are wired to look for consistency and you want to say, oh, well, this works for most people, and so this is going to be the best practice. But then somebody who's wired like me is like, but what about the 40% that you're leaving out? Because 40%, when you're talking about 200 people, might be a small number. But when you're talking about 200,000 or 2 million or 2 billion, all of a sudden those numbers become really relevant, because the likelihood of me being in the 40% that whatever it is we're talking about doesn't work for is pretty high. Like it's fairly high already, even when you're only talking 200 people, but it is very high the bigger that number gets. And it's part of why we waited for so long. I waited for so long before releasing nonfiction books, because I felt like I needed to validate and validate and validate. And I was trying to speak to 100% of people. One of the essential pain moments of my life was that moment of recognizing not only that I couldn't help every single person, like there was no way to write a book that would help every single person, or that every single person would like, or that would fix every single person's problem. Similarly, when I talk about burnout recovery, it's the most effective when it's one-on-one and I'm taking into account every single thing about you. But when I make pronouncements like above 75% or above 95%, what I'm trying to say is there's a segment of recovery that is more predictably a place where we want to start pushing high, like when I'm mostly recovered. And then there are places where we want to not push. So the lower I am on that scale, the more I want to not push myself to be back at full throttle again, because that's where it's dangerous to just tip right back down into the pit, which sounds fun, but it's not. If any of you have ever been in that spot where you feel like you're recovered, but you still know you don't have the energy and you want to push yourself for some other reason, right? Like you feel some external sense or some, again, stakes haven't been changed. But the reason that I bring that up at all is because I know some people are going to be listening to this and thinking, is it 75 or is it 95? And what I'm saying is, so if I were to give statistics, which I hate doing in this case, because you never know where you fit, but if I were to give statistics, I would say that standard deviation would be above 75%, right? Because for most people, you're on a trajectory at that point that you're not going to push yourself hard enough, that it's dangerous to start pushing yourself at 75. But in those outliers, right, the farther I get away from that center of the statistical standard, the more likely I am to be that person who's going to push myself really hard, really fast, and want to be back at 100 when I'm at 75. So for those people, I will often say, wait longer to go full throttle again, because we want to make sure that you're really not in danger of sliding back down. But at some point, we really do want to push ourselves back. And so what I always say is, if you imagine the ladder, and you're actually climbing up each time you do recover, and you do the step back forward, but eventually you get up to this, let's say above 75 or above 90%, then I can see the road out there, right? Like I can see the other side of the pit, and I want to get out of this place, but I also want to not go back into it. And so the primary fear is always, if I push myself too hard and too fast, am I going to fall back in? And that is not what we see generally. Like you have to be very, very aggressive in the wrong places and also have not fixed any of the reasons that get you back into burnout. And even then, it still is going to take you some time to get back into burnout again. But will it happen? Yes. If you push too hard at the wrong time. So this is why I say I like to wait until people are, are chomping at the bit to get back to normal before I'm like, okay, now if you used to release 8 books a year, like, okay, let's think about releasing 8 books again. But have we changed the things that got us to that place? If part of what got me burned out was going into author groups all the time and trying to figure out every single thing I can do to sell better, then have I changed that behavior? Am I limiting when I'm going to go do that? And what's interesting is it's like, and again, because for every person is different, but what's interesting is there often is a resistance to not doing those things because there was enough of either a fear of missing out on something, or there was enough of a promise that was made that I am just like right away want to go back to that place again. So I'm always having to be the calming agent, right? Like, okay, right, but what if we took a sane approach to this instead? And what if it was possible to get where you want to go without completely burning yourself out? That's always the approach that I want to take. Not because I want people not to work hard or I want people not to try or not to go back to full throttle, but because I know that if you're always making your personal well-being dependent on outcomes, then the burnout is going to happen over and over. And sometime it's going to get to a point where you can't recover on the same level anymore. But I definitely have seen it happen over and over again, enough to know that at some point I lose my ability to have that physical, intellectual resilience. And I don't want to continue to push myself into burnout for so long that I am never able to recover from it. I just don't want that to happen. So resetting stakes, renegotiating things internally, especially doing work, which I know anybody who listens to this podcast regularly is into doing the work that it takes to become a resilient person. A resilient person. If you are not, you will hate the sound of my voice and think I have a windbag, which is fine. It's so cute. Just on a side note, I went and read some of the negative reviews the other day, and it was really interesting to watch what people had to say who didn't like me, because immediately I could pick out like, oh yeah, you definitely wouldn't like me if that's what you're looking for. Oh boy, yeah, like I understand that I'm not for everybody. And it's funny because I don't I don't ever expect logically that I will be. But again, like I said before, there's this desire to see everyone get what they need, or everyone get that 100%, right? Like I want to get 100% of people what they need. And sometimes that means that what they need is not me. Like that's actually a good thing, that they can find other people who will give them what they need or what they want. I'm happy for that, because Lord knows I can't I can't do all of it. But anyway, the reason I bring this up at the end of the Burnout Recovery series is that I did really make some changes about my behavior. And one of the biggest changes that I made was how much I let myself be on social media, period. Because even though I'm not high in empathy, I'm high enough in connectedness that it affects me so often when I feel like there's something that I need to be doing that isn't actually something I need to be doing, because my doing something isn't going to help, or is going to add to the problem or whatever. So I'm very, very reluctant to spend any time on social media at this point, which is probably a good thing for me because it has allowed me to recover from burnout, which has been nice. I am engaging a little bit more on social media lately, which I feel like I'm so high in yellow and blue strengths. I just like it. Like I like being where all the people are. That's my personality. But if you're the type of person who doesn't enjoy that, go watch our QuitCast episodes where we question the premise of whether or not you need to do social media, because not everybody needs to have a primary social media presence. Not everyone needs to be looking for the next thing or trying to find this one secret silver bullet key that's going to fix all of their problems. And so again, take me with a grain of salt as always. But I'm definitely feeling back to being better, especially better than I was. And I think a lot of it has to do with the changes that I've made. So as we're ending the burnout series, I do want you to think about the changes that you make or have made that are going to keep the burnout from happening. And if you haven't identified what those places are, what the choices are, what the stakes were that got you into this burnout place, I highly recommend doing that introspection or getting some coaching or therapy around that so that you can feel what it is that's true for you. What are your what is your wiring maybe predisposing you to doing or to thinking or to expecting that is causing you to burn out? What are the things in your environment? Or again, like I reference the pandemic a lot because some of us have these new and different strengths where we need to get out and have new experiences, hear new things, meet new people. And we haven't been able to do that. And so that is affecting some of us in a pretty major way. So I'm always the person who's like, are you getting what you need out of your strengths? And look at the core of that strength. Like if you have your full 34 report, pull it out right now and start reading and look for the things that resonate with you about what it is that gives you energy. What do you need in order to function with your strengths? And you can go back and listen to other videos of ours to hear more about that because we talk about it enough. And additionally, of course, if you want the links to the strengths videos, which are currently unlisted on YouTube, but we do have a list of those links, I'm happy to send those to you. You can email assistant@betterfasteracademy.com. And if you have any questions about anything, please do also feel free to email her, Annette. Thank you, Annette. She won't know this is coming. I better prepare her for it. But please, if you have any questions, do ask them. I want to thank everyone for being part of this Burnout Recovery series. I know that it has been painful for some of us to see these come up consistently, just because either the memory of burnout is so painful, or we don't want to talk about it, or we don't want to acknowledge it. And that's totally fine. We're done now. Burnout Recovery is finished. We're not going to talk about it anymore. We are going to have a brand new couple of videos, one about strengths, which will be interesting. We're going to talk about making room for strengths next. And then I have one more video I want to release about anxiety with writers. And then we are going to start into the marketing myths. And so I hope that you will enjoy the rest of the content that we have planned for you in a while. Also, make sure to watch your inboxes. And if you're on the Patreon, watch your Patreon inbox about announcements about the forthcoming intuitive book, because I'm working on that right now. And I'm going to start releasing some of the content to the YouTube, or to the, I'm going to start releasing some of the content to the Patreon so that we can get those, get that book out into everybody's hands. So thank you so much for being here today and for listening and paying attention and talking about burnout recovery with me. I'm very grateful and glad to be on my way out, if not out. I'm hopeful that I'm out, and am returning a little bit more to normal. So thank you all for being here so much, and I'll see you on the next QuitCast. Bye, everybody.